By almost any measure people use to rank a place, the Maldives wins. The clearest water, the whitest sand, the most photographed sunsets on the planet. People save for years to come here. They spend more for a single night in one of its overwater villas than many of them earn in a week. And they come anyway. More than 1.5 million of them every year, to a country of barely 500,000 people. It is also the lowest country on Earth. %80 of its land sits less than 1 meter above the sea. Its highest natural point of ground stands around 2.5 meters, lower than the ceiling of the room you are sitting in. There is no hill in the entire nation, no mountain, no high ground to run to. Neither of those facts is an exaggeration. The luxury is real. 80% of the country's economy comes from people arriving to lie beside that water. And the vulnerability is real too. The same scientists who study the ice at the poles have run the numbers on these islands, and the numbers say that by the year 2050, 4/5 of the Maldives could be uninhabitable. By the end of the century, the entire country could be gone. So both things are true at the same time. This is the place people travel across the world to see before they die. And it may not outlive the people who photograph it. The honeymoon albums, the framed prints, the postcards on 1,000 refrigerators, many of them will last longer than the country in them. What exactly is disappearing when a place like this goes under the water? The answer is not what most people think, because most people have never actually seen the Maldives. They have seen a resort. Our islands are slowly being inundated by the sea, one by one. Those were the words of a Maldivian president, spoken not to his own people, but to a hall full of world leaders. If we do not reverse this trend, the Maldives will cease to exist by the end of this century. And in 2009, a few years before he said that, this small country's government did something no government on Earth had ever done: to force the rest of us to look. We will come back to that. First, you have to understand what is actually here. This is the Maldives, a chain of nearly 1,200 coral islands scattered across the Indian Ocean, southwest of India and Sri Lanka, grouped into 26 natural rings called atolls. The word atoll itself is one of the very few words the English language borrowed from the Maldivian tongue. The country covers some 90,000 square kilometers, but more than 99% of that is open ocean. The actual land, all of it added together, would fit comfortably inside a single mid-sized city. 500,000 people live on those specks of sand. They are not transplants. They are one of the oldest continuous island civilizations on Earth, with a language, a script, a cuisine, and a 1,000-year written history that almost none of the tourists sleeping in the villas will ever hear a word about. To find them, You don't go to a resort, you go to the capital. Malé is not what you are expecting. There are no beaches here, no palm-fringed lagoon. From the air, the capital of the world's most famous paradise looks like a single dense block of concrete dropped into the sea. Buildings packed wall to wall, painted every color, rising 6 and 8 and 10 stories straight up out of the water, with no gap of green between them. It looks less like a tropical island and more like a city that was poured, all at once, onto a raft. On a piece of land, barely 2 square kilometers across, somewhere close to 200,000 people live. To put that in proportion, that is more than 3 times the population density of Manhattan. You can walk from one side of the island to the other in about 20 minutes, and in those 20 minutes, you pass more people than live in many entire countries' capitals. Everything is here because everything has to be. The hospitals, the high schools, the government, the courts, the jobs. For a young person born on a distant island, 200 miles and a day's boat ride from anywhere, the capital is the only place a future is on offer. So they come, and they keep coming, until a third of the entire nation is stacked onto this one tiny rectangle of reclaimed ground. It has always been the center. Long before the concrete, this was the King's Island, the seat of the sultans, the one island in the whole archipelago where power lived. Everything radiated from here: trade, religion, law. And so when the modern country needed somewhere to put its institutions, it put them where they had always been. The density is not an accident of planning. It is 1,000 years of gravity pulling the whole nation toward a single point on the map. You can feel that pull most clearly at the waterfront, at the fish market. In the afternoon, the donies come in low in the water, heavy with the day's tuna, and the catch is carried ashore on men's shoulders and laid out in gleaming rows on the wet concrete. There are no nets of anonymous fish here. Each one was caught by hand, on a line, and you can watch the whole country's diet change hands in an hour. The buying, the bargaining, the long curved knives, the smell of salt and diesel and engine smoke. It is loud and crowded and entirely real. And it is the one place in the capital where a visitor might accidentally see the actual Maldives at work. Around the back, beside the mosque, is a small tomb. We will come back to the man inside it, because the story of how he arrived here is one of the strangest and darkest in the country's history. But to understand why anyone came to these islands at all, why ships from China and Arabia and East Africa once changed course to reach this remote scatter of sand, you have to know what the Maldives used to make. It did not make spices. It did not make gold. It made money. Quite literally, for 1,000 years, this country minted the closest thing the medieval world had to a global currency. And it grew that money in the shallows. The money was a snail, a small sea snail, no bigger than the tip of your thumb, with a glossy, domed shell the color of cream and old ivory. Its name is the money cowrie, and the Maldives, almost alone in the world, had them in their billions. Maldivians, mostly women, would lay palm fronds in the warm lagoon shallows. The snails would crawl onto them by the thousands. The fronds were hauled up, the snails left to dry, the shells cleaned and sorted and poured into sacks. Those shells were the perfect currency, and not by accident. They were small, so you could carry a fortune in a pouch. They were nearly identical, so you could count them out by weight. They were beautiful, so people wanted them. And unlike a coin, they were impossible to forge because no human hand could make one. Only the sea could. When the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta arrives in the Maldives in the 1340s, this trade is at its height. He stays for months. He marries into local families. He is appointed a Qadi, an Islamic judge, and he records what he sees with an outsider's astonishment. He watches the islanders load cowries by the boatload. 40 ships a year, he writes, leave these islands packed with nothing but shells. A single gold dinar, he notes, was worth 400,000 of them. But Ibn Battuta records more than commerce. As a judge, he lives inside the society, and what he sees unsettles and fascinates him in equal measure. He notes that the women of these islands hold a status he has seen almost nowhere else in his travels, that marriage and divorce are easy and common, that descent and inheritance run in ways the rest of the Islamic world would find strange, that queens have sat on this throne. He is scandalized that the islanders go about only half-clothed in the heat and tries, with limited success, to make the women of his own household cover themselves. He fits 1,000 years of the country's character into a few pages. Devout, but on its own terms, connected to the world, but shaped by no one but the sea. Those shells went everywhere. They were the small change of Bengal, the temple offerings of China, the bride price of West Africa. From these quiet lagoons, the Maldivian cowrie traveled further than any Maldivian ever did, across the Indian Ocean, up the rivers of Africa, into markets that had never heard the country's name. And then the same shells were swept into something far darker. By the 17th and 18th centuries, European trading companies had discovered what the Maldives had always known, that a shell which cost almost nothing here was treated as real money in West Africa. So they came for the cowries by the shipload, as ballast, as cargo, and carried them to the coast of Guinea, and there they spent them. On people. The bright little shells grown in these turquoise shallows became one of the currencies of the transatlantic slave trade. Human beings were bought, in part, with money harvested by Maldivian women from a lagoon. The country never saw the coast where it happened, but the shells did. That is a side of paradise that does not appear in any brochure. The faith that those carved mosques belong to has its own dark arrival story, and for most of the country's history, it was not the faith here at all. For more than 1,000 years before Islam, the Maldives was Buddhist. Settlers came from Sri Lanka and India before the time of Christ, and they built. On as many as 59 separate islands, archaeologists have found the remains of stupas and monasteries, great rounded mounds of coral and earth that the Maldivians still call hawitas. Most lie buried now, swallowed by sand and undergrowth on remote islands, their stories nearly erased. But they were there for 1,000 years. On the island of Kudahuvadhoo, far to the south, one of these mounds still rises from the ground, and when archaeologists examined the masonry beneath it, they found stonework so finely cut, so precisely joined, that it rivals the famous masonry of the Andes. On other islands, diggers have turned up the head of a coral stone Buddha, serene and weathered, buried in the sand of a country that now forbids the religion that carved it. These are not ruins the country advertises. There are no signs, no ticket booths, no tours. The Buddhist Maldives is a thing you have to know to look for. A whole civilization sleeping under the sand of islands whose names the tourists never learn. This was a Buddhist nation longer than it has been a Muslim one. The change, when it came, was not gentle. The year is 1153. According to a document carved on copper plates that still survives, the Loma Fanu, the conversion of the southern atolls did not happen by quiet persuasion. It describes Buddhist monks taken from the islands to the capital and beheaded. It describes statues and stupas smashed, faces of the Buddha chiseled away, monasteries pulled down. 1,000 years of one faith were dismantled, island by island, in the span of a few decades. But that is the historian's version. The version the country tells itself is a legend, and the legend has a monster in it. They called it Ranamari, a demon that came from the sea. Every month, the story goes, the people of Male had to leave a young girl alone overnight in a temple at the water's edge. Each dawn, her family would return to find her dead. Month after month, year after year, a whole nation living under a tax paid in daughters. Then, a traveler arrives, a man from the Maghreb named Abu al-Barakat. He offers to take the place of the next girl. He sits alone in the temple through the night, and instead of waiting in terror, he recites the Quran. When dawn comes, the family returns, expecting a body. They find him alive. The demon never returns. And the king, the legend says, converts on the spot, and the islands follow him into Islam. That man, Abu al-Barakat, is the one buried in the small tomb beside the old Friday Mosque. To this day, people leave offerings there. The legend is taught in schools, performed in plays, printed in tourist pamphlets. A story of light defeating a monster. But folklorists have noticed something. The demon's name, Ranamari, appears to belong to an older South Indian goddess. And in the oldest layers of Maldivian folklore, the sea is full of female spirits, powerful and dangerous. The monster, in other words, may be older than the story that defeats it, a memory of something the islands worshipped before, dressed up as the thing that had to be destroyed. What was lost in 1153 was not just a faith, it was a way of seeing the ocean itself. And the ocean is the only thing this country has ever really had. Go back to that coral the old mosque was carved from. It is not stone, it was never stone. Every reef in the Maldives, every island in fact, is the work of a single animal so small you would need a lens to see it clearly. The coral polyp, a soft, translucent creature barely a few millimeters across, a tiny sac with a ring of tentacles related to the jellyfish. On its own, it is almost nothing. But it does one extraordinary thing. It pulls dissolved minerals out of seawater and builds itself a cup of limestone to live in. And then it does it again. And its offspring build on top of it, and theirs on top of them. Generation upon generation for thousands of years, each one cementing its skeleton to the bones of the dead below. Every island in the Maldives is a graveyard and a city at once, built grain by microscopic grain by an animal that has been quietly constructing this country for longer than there have been people to live on it. The Maldives did not appear in the sea, it was grown by the coral. The polyp is the true founder of the nation. And, as we will see, its health and the nation's survival are now the same question. For now, follow the reef out from the capital, away from the concrete into the open atolls, and the country opens into something else entirely. In a single bay in Bar Atoll, called Hanifaru, the water can fill with shadows. When the monsoon currents are right, they sweep a soup of tiny plankton into this one small bay and trap it there. And the giants come to feed. Reef manta rays, animals with wingspans wider than a car is long, glide in by the dozen, then the score, then the 100. They wheel through the plankton in slow, looping chains, somersaulting backward through their own food, one behind another, until the whole bay is a turning column of wings. On the richest days, more than 100 mantas gather in a space smaller than a football field. It is the largest known gathering of manta rays anywhere on the planet, and the Maldives holds the largest population of these reef mantas in the world. More than 5,000 of them, each one identifiable by the unique pattern of spots on its belly, like a fingerprint. They are not the only giants. In the channels of the south, the largest fish in the ocean cruises these waters all year round. The whale shark, a creature the length of a bus, its back a galaxy of pale spots, its mouth a meter wide and utterly harmless, sieving plankton from the water as it goes. In most of the world, a whale shark is a once-in-a-lifetime sighting. Here, they never really leave. The country learned, the hard way, what these animals were worth alive. Sharks were once hunted in these waters for their fins. Then, in 2010, the Maldives did something almost no nation had done. It declared its entire territory, all 90,000 square kilometers of it, a shark sanctuary, banning the catch outright. The logic was as much economic as moral. A single whale shark, swimming free off the southern atolls, will be visited by divers again and again for decades, year after year. The same animal, killed once, is worth almost nothing. In a country with no oil, no minerals, and almost no land, the living reef and the creatures on it are not a luxury. They are the treasury. And on the boat ride home, the sea sends its escort. Spinner dolphins, slim, fast, and tireless, gather in the channels by the hundreds as the light goes gold, and they ride the bow waves of the dhonis for the sheer momentum of it. Their name comes from what they do in the air. A spinner dolphin will leap clear of the water and spin, twisting its whole body on its long axis, as many as 7 full rotations before it falls back. Scientists still argue about why. To shake off parasites, to signal the pod, perhaps simply because it can. Off these islands, a dusk boat ride almost guarantees the sight. The water breaking again and again with bodies turning in the air. After 1,000 years of Maldivians reading this sea for tuna and weather and cowries, the dolphins are the part of it that seems to be reading them back. This is the Maldives the country actually lives on, not the villas, the reef beneath them. The coral that built the islands also feeds them, shelters them, and most important of all, defends them. A healthy reef is a breakwater. It takes the full force of an ocean's swell and shatters it offshore, so that what finally laps the beach is gentle. Without the reef, the islands would have been scoured away tens of thousands of years ago. The coral is not a decoration around the Maldives, it is the wall around the Maldives. which is why what happened in 2016 was not just an ecological tragedy, it was a national one. That year, the ocean ran a fever. A marine heat wave pushed water temperatures past the point coral can survive. When the polyp gets too hot, it expels the colorful algae living inside it, the algae that feed it and give it its color. What's left is a ghost, a white, starving skeleton. They call it bleaching, and in 2016, across the Maldives, an estimated 60% of the coral bleached. Whole reefs that had taken centuries to build turned bone white in a season. Remember what the reef does. It is the wall. When the coral dies, the wall comes down, and the rising sea, which is the country's great enemy, finds an opening that the polyp had been quietly closing for 10,000 years. So now, in the shallows of some of these islands, you will find Maldivians on their knees in the water, divers, students, fishermen's children, fixing fragments of living coral onto metal frames and printed bases, building artificial reefs by hand, trying to give the polyp a foothold again. They are, in the most literal sense, rebuilding the foundations of their own country, one fragment at a time. Whether they can build faster than the ocean can kill is a question no one can yet answer. To understand what is at stake, you have to leave the reef and go to the people who depend on it most, and they are not in the capital and not in the resorts. They are on the small islands, the ones with no airport. On a local island, somewhere like Thodu or any of a few hundred others, the day still begins the way it has for 1,000 years, on the water. Maldivians have the highest rate of fish consumption of any people on Earth. Fish is more than 80% of the protein they eat, and the fish that built this culture is the tuna. But not caught the way the rest of the world catches tuna. No vast nets, no long lines, no industrial trawlers scraping the sea empty. The Maldivian method is older and stranger. Pole and line. One fish, one hook, one fisherman, hauled aboard by hand, over and over, all day. It is brutally hard work, and it is one of the most sustainable fisheries left on the planet. They take the tuna, and they leave the reef, the dolphins, and the turtles untouched. The yellowfin tuna is the national animal of the Maldives, not a flower, not a bird, a fish. Because here, the fish is the country. And the two great trades of Maldivian history, the shells and the tuna, were never really separate. Historians who have studied these islands believe the offshore tuna fishery grew up alongside the cowrie trade centuries ago, feeding the crews and the divers and the traders who worked the lagoons. A people who could harvest the sea for money learned in the same waters to harvest it for food. Dried and salted, the tuna could travel as far as the shells did. For 1,000 years, this was the engine of the place, a small nation that took two things from the ocean, currency and protein, and lived entirely on what the water would give. But the small islands are emptying. The school here only goes so far. The clinic can only do so much. The boat to the capital takes most of a day. And so the young people leave, for Male, for the jobs, for the future. And the old people stay, and the houses go quiet, and the pole and line skills that took a lifetime to learn are no longer passed down, because there is no one left on the island to pass them to. Climate change is the threat everyone names. But the islands are also being hollowed out from the inside, one departure at a time, long before the water ever reaches the door. And down in those same warm shallows, almost too small to notice, lives a fish that exists nowhere else on Earth. The Maldivian anemone fish. A clownfish, orange and black, no longer than a finger, but a particular one, found only in these waters and the seas immediately around them. It lives, as all clownfish do, inside the stinging tentacles of a sea anemone, coated in a mucus that makes it immune to the sting that would kill any other fish. The anemone gives it a home no predator dares enter. In return, the little fish drives off the anemone's enemies and keeps it clean. Neither could thrive without the other. It is a small thing, easy to swim past. But it is the country in miniature, a creature that survives only by living inside the very thing that should be too dangerous to touch. A nation built on the edge of an ocean that could erase it, and at home there and nowhere else. Which brings us at last to the thing the tourists do see, the thing that pays for all of it, the resort island. The model is unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. One island, one resort. An entire coral island, sometimes no bigger than a few football fields, given over to a single hotel. The overwater villas on their stilts, the private jetties, the staff who arrive by boat at dawn and leave by boat at night, because they do not live there. Almost no Maldivian does. The guests fly into the capital, transfer straight to a seaplane, and never touch a local island, never see Malay's concrete towers, never meet the country at all. They see a stage set, a beautiful, sincere, carefully maintained stage set, sitting a few miles from a nation of 500,000 people fighting for its life. That is the perception gap at the heart of this place. More than 1 million people a year come to the Maldives. The overwhelming majority of them leave having seen a resort, a reef, and a sunset, and nothing of the country that owns them. The tourism is not a lie, it is real, and it is the 80% of the economy that keeps the lights on across all 1,200 islands. But it is a single bright room in a very large house, and most visitors never open the other doors. Behind that bright room, the government has been quietly building something else, something that looks at first like just another island. It is called Hulhumale, and they did not find it. They made it. Starting in the late 1990s, the Maldives began doing the only thing a country with no high ground can do. It began manufacturing land. Dredgers pulled millions of tons of sand up off the seabed and pumped it into the shallows beside the capital, packing it into a new island where there had been only lagoon. Today, Hulhumale is home to tens of thousands of people, with room planned for many more, a whole new city with wide, straight avenues, utterly unlike the tangled lanes of old Male. But the most important thing about Hulhumale is not its size, it is its height. The new island was deliberately built up to around 2 meters above sea level, almost twice as high as old Male. That extra meter is not an accident. It is the entire point. In the planning documents, in the quiet language of engineers, Hulhumale has a nickname. They call it the City of Hope. And you should ask yourself why a city needs to be called that. The answer is that it is a lifeboat. Hulhumale is being built high on purpose because the people who built it know that one day the islands their grandparents lived on may no longer be above the water, and the population will have to go somewhere. It is a refuge, raised out of the sea in advance of a flood that has not fully arrived. A country preparing, with sand and dredges, to retreat onto higher ground that did not exist until it built it. And it is already filling. Many of the people moving into Hulhumale's wide new avenues are the same ones draining out of the distant islands. Families from atolls a day's boat ride away, chasing the schools and the clinics and the work that only the capital region offers. So the lifeboat is doing two jobs at once. It is holding the future flood at bay, and it is absorbing a migration that is happening right now, today, island by emptying island. The water has not yet taken those outer homes, but the City of Hope is already receiving their children. But land is not the only thing being built across these waters. There are also bridges, and the bridges carry a different kind of weight. In 2018, a long, low span of concrete opened across the water, linking the capital island of Male to the airport island and on to Hulhumale. For a country where you once could not cross from one island to the next without a boat, it changed everything. They call it the Sinamale Bridge. It was built by China, and there, in 2 miles of roadway, is the other paradox of the modern Maldives. This is a small Indian Ocean democracy that has historically looked to India, its huge neighbor to the north, as its closest partner. But its survival now costs more money than it could ever raise on its own. Sea walls, reclaimed islands, bridges. The bill for staying alive runs into the billions, and the nations with the deepest pockets, China among them, have been glad to lend it, and to build it, and to gain influence with every loan. A country fighting to keep its head above the water finds itself caught between rising seas on one side and rising powers on the other, owing more with every meter of coastline it tries to defend. That dependence has a history. In 1988, a band of armed mercenaries landed by boat in the dead of night and tried to seize the capital by force, taking hostages and very nearly toppling the government. It was India, the large neighbor to the north, that answered the country's call, flying in paratroopers within hours to put the coup down. The Maldives never forgot who came when the boats arrived, and that memory is part of what makes the new arrangement so fraught. A nation that once owed its government's survival to one great power now owes its island's survival, in concrete and debt, increasingly to another. And the coastline is everywhere, because this country is not one place. It is hundreds. Far to the south, almost on the equator, lies Adu Atoll, where the British kept an air base through the Second World War, and where the accent and the customs still differ from the capital a few hundred miles north. Scattered through the southern atolls, the equator itself runs invisibly through the sea, so that a single country has 1 foot in each hemisphere. On the island of Vadu, on certain nights, the breaking waves glow, a cold blue light in the surf made by tiny luminous plankton, so that people walk a shoreline lit from within by the sea. There are islands where craftsmen still turn wood on a hand lathe and lacquer it in red and black and yellow, a craft called livelihoods, passed down for centuries. And the whole country is held together still by the dhonie, the curved wooden sailing boat whose shape has barely changed in 1,000 years, and the coconut palm, which gives timber and rope and food and shade, and which the country counts as its national tree. The Maldivians even have their own writing, a script called Thana, written from right to left, unlike any other in the world. Its letters built partly from Arabic numerals, a system invented here, for a language called Divehi, spoken nowhere else. For a place the world imagines as empty water with villas on top, the Maldives is one of the most distinct small cultures on the planet. And for stretches of its history, it was ruled by women. Sultanas who held the throne in their own right, in an age when most of the world would not allow it. And through all of it, through 1,000 years of monsoons and trade and conversion and empire, one animal has come ashore on these beaches to lay its eggs, generation after generation, since long before any of it began. The sea turtle. Green turtles and hawksbills, ancient mariners that cross entire oceans and then, by a sense no one fully understands, return to the exact beach where they themselves hatched, to dig a nest and bury a clutch of eggs in the sand. They have been doing this for more than 100 million years, since before the islands existed, since before the coral that made them. They survived the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. But the beaches are changing under them. As the sea rises and the reefs weaken, the nesting beaches erode, and the strip of sand a turtle needs to lay her eggs grows thinner every year. An animal that has outlasted nearly everything now depends on a coastline that is being pulled out from beneath it. The same coastline the people depend on. The turtle and the nation are, in the end, in exactly the same race. And that race has, in this country's recent history, come to a head twice. Once by surprise, once on purpose. The surprise came on the morning of December 26, 2004. Far away, off the coast of Sumatra, the seafloor ruptures in one of the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. It sends a wall of water racing outward across the Indian Ocean, and the Maldives, lying flat and low in its path, has nowhere to hide. The wave does not tower over the islands like a cliff. The country is too low for that. It simply rolls over them. Across dozens of islands, the sea comes in one side and goes out the other, taking houses, boats, freshwater wells, and lives with it. More than 100 people die. Whole islands are rendered uninhabitable in minutes. For the first time, the country sees in a single morning exactly what total inundation looks like, not as a projection on a scientist's chart, but as a thing that has already happened to real islands with real people on them. The capital survived that day for one reason. Years earlier, after lesser floods, the government had ringed Malé with a sea wall, a barrier of concrete blocks paid for largely by Japan, built around the island like a fortress. When the tsunami came, that wall held. The water that drowned other islands broke against Malé's defenses and largely fell back. One island had a wall and lived. The rest did not, and did not. But there are nearly 1,200 islands in the Maldives, and you cannot build a wall around all of them. The arithmetic of survival laid bare in a single morning. The country can save the places it can afford to fortify, and it cannot afford to fortify them all. Which brings us to the second time the country faced the water, not by surprise, but as a choice. The moment we left at the very beginning. His name was Mohammed Nasheed. He had spent years in and out of prison as a dissident before becoming, in 2008, the first democratically elected president in the country's history. His own story was a study in persistence. He had been a journalist who criticized the government and was jailed for it, held in solitary, by his own account, tortured, again and again across the long decades when the Maldives was ruled by a single man. His election in 2008 ended 30 years of that rule, and his time in office was short and turbulent. In 2012, he was forced from the presidency in a matter of hours, resigning, he later said, with soldiers and police at his door. Years after that, in 2021, a bomb was detonated near his home as he stepped toward his car, and he barely survived it. Through all of it, the cells, the coup, the shrapnel, he kept returning to the same single subject, the one threat he believed was larger than any of his enemies: the sea. And he understood something that the scientists' graphs had failed to make the world feel: that an island nation cannot save itself alone. The carbon that is warming the ocean is not Maldivian carbon. The Maldives produces almost none of it. The country with the most to lose has done the least to cause it. And no seawall, no reclaimed island, no amount of dredged sand can hold back a sea that the rest of the world keeps raising. The only thing that can save the Maldives is a decision made in other countries, countries that for the most part were not listening. So in October of 2009, Nasheed decided to make them look. On the 17th, the president of the Maldives and 11 of his ministers put on scuba gear, and they went down. 20 feet beneath the surface of a lagoon, they sat at a table on the sea floor, with the coral around them and fish drifting past their faces, and they held a meeting of the cabinet of the government, underwater. They had a table. They had waterproof slates and pens. They communicated in hand signals, and there, on the bottom of the ocean, with bubbles rising from their masks, the elected government of a sovereign nation signed a document, a plea to every country on Earth to cut the emissions that were drowning them. Then they presented it to the world's leaders, gathered weeks later in Copenhagen. The images went everywhere: a president in a wetsuit governing his country from the sea floor. Some of the world's press treated it as a stunt, a clever piece of theater from a small country desperate for attention. It was theater, but it was not a stunt. It was a rehearsal. Those ministers were not pretending to be somewhere absurd. They were sitting deliberately in the future of their own country, a future in which the cabinet room, the capital, the islands their grandmothers were born on are all under exactly that much water. They went down there to show the world what their nation will look like if nothing changes. Not a metaphor, a weather report. And the question they were really asking was the oldest question this country has ever faced. Remember what the Maldives once was, the place that grew the world's money, whose little cowrie shells paid for goods and temples and, to its lasting shame, for human beings across half the planet. For 1,000 years, the Maldives helped finance the world. Now, sinking, it was reduced to asking the world to finance its survival, to pay, in carbon cuts and climate funds, a debt the world did not believe it owed. The nation that once minted the money of empires now stood underwater, asking for help, and was largely told to wait. So if the world will not stop the sea, what is left? Only the things the Maldivians can do with their own hands, and they have not stopped trying. They are still raising land, Hulhumalay, the city of hope, growing higher and wider beside the capital, ready to take the people of islands that can no longer hold them. They are still rebuilding the reef, fragment by fragment, trying to repair the natural wall that the heat keeps breaking. And in the lagoon, a short boat ride from the capital, engineers have begun work on something stranger still: a floating city. A grid of hexagonal platforms, modeled on the pattern of brain coral, designed to rise and fall with the sea instead of fighting it. Homes for thousands of people that do not sit on land at all, but float on the water, rising as the ocean rises. The country that the sea is trying to erase is attempting in answer to learn to live on the water's surface entirely, to stop being islanders and become something the world has never quite seen before, a people who live, by choice, afloat. Climate refugees or climate innovators, the Maldives is trying with everything it has to be the second thing, to rewrite the ending in which it simply disappears. But here is the truth that the floating cities and the reclaimed islands and the rebuilt reefs cannot change. None of it decides the outcome. A floating district can house thousands. It cannot house 500,000. Hudhumalay can be raised another meter. The ocean can be raised 2. The reef can be replanted by hand. It cannot be replanted faster than a warming sea can kill it. Every one of these answers buys time. Not one of them buys certainty. And the lever that actually controls the sea is held in capitals thousands of miles away by people for whom the Maldives is, at most, a place they once thought of going on a holiday. So we come back to where we started, to the photographs. Across the world, in albums and frames and phones, there are millions of images of this country, the water, the sand, the villa on its stilts at sunset. Ordinary, beautiful, forgettable holiday pictures. And there is a real chance, a serious chance, that some of those pictures will outlive the place they were taken. That a child not yet born will one day look at a photograph of a turquoise lagoon and an island of white sand and have to be told that there used to be a country there, that people lived on it for 3,000 years, that it grew the world's first money and wrote its own script and carved mosques out of the reef and fished one line at a time and ruled itself and tried, at the very end, in wetsuits on the sea floor, to make the rest of us listen. No one knows yet whether that is the ending. The Maldives is not gone. 500,000 people are still here, still building higher, still planting coral, still hauling tuna over the side, one fish at a time, still refusing the future the numbers describe. Whether that refusal is enough was never entirely theirs to decide. The country that grew the money of half the world is now asking the world for the one thing it cannot grow itself: time. How much it gets, and whether the islands are still above the water when the answer finally comes, is a question the Maldives cannot answer alone. Thank you for watching. Until the next journey,